Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Concussion Nerds podcast. And today we're talking about how we begin aerobic exercise after an acute concussion. So, we're going to make this episode really practical. I am going to guide you through the exact tools and the strategy that we use at my clinic at Symphony Brain Performance. This protocol gets used for our acute concussions. Now, I am going to drop in here, however, as we go through this, if you are working with a medical team already, please be safe. Don't make any changes to your medical program until you've discussed it with them. This episode is meant to be a guide for the clinicians as you're starting to figure out how to introduce aerobic activity to your clients. And as someone on a journey, you're trying to figure out how to do it and do it for yourself. Okay. So one of the previous episodes, we talked about the power of a little bit of aerobic activity. And I promised you an episode on how the heck do you start to do it. So that is what this one is. Whew, let's go. So one of the most evidence-supported interventions to help increase the rate of recovery after concussion is the introduction of a sub-threshold aerobic training program, right? Sub-threshold ultimately meaning before symptom exacerbation. There's some new studies that show we can push into symptoms a little bit, but we're going to talk about that in more detail. But this is the most evidence-supported intervention. Aerobic activity has been compared to those groups that just do stretching. It's been compared to groups that do yoga. It's been compared to groups that just rest. And in every single one of those interventions, those participants who were in the aerobic exercise groups had a faster recovery. So when we talk about really getting connected with a clinician in those early days, one of the key pieces of that is so that they can support you in building this gradual reintroduction to aerobic activity. Okay. Cardiovascular aerobic activity, obviously meaning we're going to elevate our heart rate, right? Which then is going to help us increase blood flow and all these amazing things. If somebody is symptomatic when we're doing aerobic activity, then they fall into that category of the physiologic or the autonomic concussion phenotype, and it's called exercise intolerance. So we're going to go through a protocol that we use at Symphony. There's a couple different ways to do it. The way we're going to talk about it today is a safer way that if you are listening to this podcast and you're trying to have some idea of how you can begin, it's a safe way to begin. If you're connecting with a clinician in a clinic, very commonly they're going to do something called the Buffalo treadmill test or the Buffalo bike test, which helps them find your basically threshold of heart rate to begin exercising at. The protocol we're using at the clinic, the one I'm going to share with you today, has been compared to that one and found to ultimately be as successful. So, and it uses a percentage of your heart rate max. Okay, so this again, a super practical episode of how do we begin aerobic activity after an acute concussion. We will do a separate episode, although it's going to be a similar thought process. We'll do a separate episode for persistent concussion. So when you have a concussion, we know that those first 48 to 72 hours are meant to be rest, right? Physical, cognitive rest. But then after that time frame, as soon as day 3 or day 4, the research is showing us that we can begin implementing aerobic activity. So if we are clinicians helping people with acute concussion, and we are saying that we ultimately want people to make an appointment with us within the first 7 days, which is the goal, that first session, if they're coming to you on day 3 or day 4, for us, it's a system screen, education, but getting them moving with guidelines. Okay. We've talked about in this acute stage, the power and the importance of not continuously pushing through and blasting through symptoms. So I really want you to think about a reframe in this too, because if you're someone who's used to exercise and exercise was a way that's a frequent part of your life, and you're used to getting a sweat on and getting super short of breath, we need to do a little mindset shift of we're not exercising here to get that sweat on. We're not exercising here to build muscle strength. We're not exercising here to increase cardiovascular endurance. Exercise here is exercising the nervous system. So although as we go through this and we talk about these protocols, although physically, you're probably able to push harder in the exercise task, neurologically and physiologically, we need to respect what that nervous system is telling us. Okay, so sometimes this gets frustrating and confusing because the actual physical output that you could do doesn't necessarily match what the nervous system is telling you to do. And that's a really important piece. So just a little bit of a mindset shift of you're not doing this to build strength. You're not doing this to build muscle mass. You're not doing this to improve cardiovascular endurance. You're doing this to support your nervous system in healing, health, and recovery. Okay. So we can begin this as soon as day 3 or day 4. So the first question, of course, is it safe? 100% absolutely safe. Okay. And all the studies that this has come out on, aerobic activity is safe after concussion. Another question is, well, what type of aerobic activity should I be doing? Okay. So am I going to be on a bike? Am I going to be on a road bike? Am I going to be on a stationary bike? Am I going to be swimming? Do I go on a treadmill? There's all these different questions. A rowing machine. Ultimately, when I do this, and when we're trying to figure out the piece of equipment, the safest option is always kind of the recumbent bike. And I say that because you're on a bike, you don't have a lot of head movement, you don't have neck movement, you don't have a moving visual environment. So therefore, if we're on a bike, it kind of stabilizes those other systems. So if you were an individual that was having a lot of dizziness with eye, head, or neck movement, then the recumbent bike is going to be your best option. Okay. For some people, they can use an upright bike depending on what position it puts you in. Okay. If you're somebody that isn't having vestibular or visual or like a ton of neck issues, then maybe you want to do this on a treadmill, right? Maybe you want to do this on a rowing machine. So what's really important to look at when you're choosing the type of aerobic activity you're doing is what are the demands it's going to put on my other systems? Because remembering the point of this exercise, the point of the aerobic component is to work on the coupling of the autonomic and cardiovascular systems, right? Which means we don't want to throw a bunch of other challenges at it right away. So anytime you're doing any sort of rehab, it's super important to remember the purpose of the activity. And so the purpose of this activity in this moment is to rehab the nervous system and that autonomic uncoupling piece of the nervous system and the cardiovascular system, not to necessarily do vestibular rehab or neck rehab or vision rehab. So if you're having these other things happen, then one of my favorites is just because it's easy and I know it kind of stabilizes those other systems is the recumbent bike. Okay, but you get to choose and you can play around with different ones. Just know that sometimes there's an experience that if you're using a recumbent bike and then you go on a treadmill, well, now the demand is different and it's stimulating other systems differently, which could impact your ability potentially to do the same intensity or the same amount of time. Okay. So step 1, choose the activity. Step 2 is you're going to want to have a heart rate monitor. So ideally we have those Polar 10 chest heart monitors, which I love. You can measure heart rate. You can use apps to do HRV and all these things. There's a lot of smartwatches that monitor heart rate as well. Or depending on where you're doing this, if you have to, you can use like the handles on the bike or the treadmill or whatever equipment you're using to measure your heart rate. So how do you know how hard to work? So again, this is a protocol that uses a percentage of heart rate max. It came from a study that was done at U of T. It was either last year or the year before, and that they found to be effective. So to find your heart rate max is calculating good old-fashioned calculation of 220 minus your age. Okay, that would be your heart rate maximum. Our goal to clear an individual on the aerobic component is that they're able to achieve 75% of that heart rate maximum number with no increase in symptoms. So when we're building return to play protocols, for example, before we return someone to a lot of sport-specific drills, we need to clear them on being able to get to 75% of their heart rate max. So then where do we start? The study from U of T has individuals start at 60% of their heart rate maximum number. So what we do in the clinic is we adapted this a little bit. And we said, if you were normally someone who was healthy and active and exercise was a part of your life, we start at the 60% of the heart rate max. If you were someone who you didn't do a lot of exercise in your life and exercise is now kind of newer again, we're going to start you lower. And we actually start you at 50% of your heart rate max, give or take. Okay. This protocol, if you move through it at the way it was intended, we do 2 days on, 1 day off as we move through the progressions. Okay. So a 2-day on, 1 day off rotation. And this is an important question. And this was one of the big questions that came out of this study that we're talking about on this podcast as well, is because one of the big questions was, as clinicians, we knew we had to prescribe aerobic exercise, but we didn't know in what capacity. We didn't know how often. There was no structure or guidelines into how we actually structurally made this program for our clients. So this study out of UT did a 2-day on, 1 day off rotation for aerobic activity. So the first session, whether you're going to be at 50% or 65% of your heart rate max, the goal is 15 minutes for the first session. So you would do a 5-minute warm-up, which is starting to obviously pedal, controlling your breath, getting up to that heart rate number, and then 15 minutes at that 50 or 60% of your heart rate maximum, and then a 5-minute cool down at the end. So our goal for the first day is 15 minutes at our target heart rate. Day 2, the percentage stays the same regardless of how we felt. And the goal is 20 minutes at the 50 or 60% of our heart rate max. 5-minute warm up, 5-minute cool down. We're going to talk about how we adjust this. And we're going to say, for this example, we're going to say we didn't get more than a 1 to 1.5 increase in symptoms as we did this protocol. Okay. So then you would have a day off. Day 2 and day 3, you're going to increase the percentage by 5. So on day 2, you would now be at either 65% or 55. So we're going to continue this with a 65% heart rate max. Target heart rate, 5-minute warm up, 20-minute session at 65%, 5-minute cool down. Same thing. So we're on day 5. Day 1 and day 2 was on, day 3 was off. Day 4 was 65%. Day 5 was 65% at 20 minutes. It would be a day off. Moving on to the next 2 days, you'd be bouncing up to 70%. Then you would have a day off. Then you would bounce up to 75%. Then you would have a day off. Now, if you are moving through the days and you are getting less than a 1.5 to 2 point increase in symptoms, and this piece is important, and you are recovering from the activity within 1 hour of doing the task, then that's considered successful and you can move forward in the protocol. Okay. So if you were at 60% on the second day at 60% and you did the 5 minutes, you exercised for 20 minutes, you did the 5-minute cool down, and you had a 1 point increase in symptoms and you felt totally fine after, then after your rest day, you're going to bounce up to 65%. Let's talk about when you need to terminate the exercise session. Okay. So say you go in and you're starting to do it and you're reaching that 2 point increase in symptoms. You need to stop. Now, what we say is you can pause. You can do some palming. So for those that are new to palming, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see me. Otherwise, I'm going to describe it. You make 2 cups with your hands, you cover them over your eyes, and you're going to take some nice breaths. It helps dampen the sensory information and it will help your symptoms come down. If you can bring your symptoms down, then you can resume the activity. But if they begin to elevate again up to that 2-point increase point again, you are done your session for that seating, no matter how much time has passed or not. Which means another way to say is you are not blasting through significantly increasing symptoms to reach your 20 minutes. So you terminate the activity if your symptoms increase greater than 2 points or they increase greater than an 8 out of 10. With 10 being on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 is you have 0 symptoms at all, you're feeling great. 10 is you are non-functional. We are taking you to the hospital in an ambulance. Okay. So if symptoms increase greater than 2 points or you are greater than an 8 out of 10, then that session is terminated. Here's the other piece. If it takes greater, so say you stayed within the 2-point increase in symptoms, but if it takes you longer than 60 minutes to recover after the exercise, then you do not get to progress. In fact, we're going to scale you back a little bit. So the whole protocol really is a little bit of like, we need to be in tune with ourselves. We need to be paying attention to what's happening in our bodies and happening in our symptoms. And it's a little bit of discovery work as we go, right? So we have, as clinicians, we have this protocol we give you, and then we ebb and flow and adjust within it based on our client's response, right? If you're a client who's trying to introduce this, because you don't have a clinician to work with, yes, again, we have a protocol, but you need to pay attention to what's happening in your body and what you're feeling in your body. So what constitutes an increase in symptoms? So let's talk about this really quick. So say you sit down and you're like, okay, I'm going to start and I'm at 70, say you're at the 70% spot. Okay. So you're starting to do your warm up and you rate yourself. You're like, you know what? I have a symptom score of 3. I got a little bit of it's mostly a little bit of a headache. And that's the only symptom I have, but it's a 3 out of 10. Okay. If the headache gets worse, that's obviously increasing symptoms. But if there's the appearance of a new symptom, that's automatically an additional point in symptom increase. Okay, so say the headache stays the same, but now you notice that you're getting a little bit dizzy. The addition of that new symptom is an increase in a symptom point. Okay, so let's recap all this again. We're going to try to make this episode just really applicable for you. 1, we want you doing aerobic activity. Yes. 2, choose the piece of equipment that is best going to serve you in getting a cardiovascular nervous system exercise. So again, for us, that really is a lot of recumbent bike because we know it stabilizes those other systems. Okay. 3, calculate your heart rate maximum. 220 minus H. Obviously ensuring you're cleared of all red flags and reasons why you shouldn't exercise if there were any that were from your medical team previously, okay? But as a whole, we know exercise is safe after concussion. 4, if you're someone who is a regular exerciser, you're an athlete, you're normally in shape, then you're going to start at like 60%. Your first day is going to be 60% of that heart rate max that you've targeted. If you are normally a less active individual or you haven't exercised in a really hard time, I'm going to say you want to start at 50% of that heart rate maximum. This number is your target heart rate or your heart rate threshold. Okay. Session number 1. You start with a 5-minute warm-up until you reach your target heart rate. The goal is 15 minutes and then a 5-minute cool down. Day 2, same percentage. 5-minute warm-up, 20 minutes at your target heart rate, 5-minute cool down. Day 3 is a rest day. Day 4, if day 1 and 2 are successful, you're going to increase your heart rate, working heart rate by 5%. So if we were at 60, we're now at 65%. 5-minute warm up, 20 minutes at 65% of your heart rate max, 5-minute cool down. The next day, you are still at 65%. 5-minute warm up, exercise, cool down, rest day. If those 2 days were successful, you're going to increase by another 5% the next day. So it's 2 days on, 1 day off. You increase by 5% after your rest day as long as you were successful in the previous grouping. What does success mean? Success in this scenario, success of an aerobic session, means that you made the prescribed period of time with symptoms not increasing more than 2 points, and those symptoms completely resolved and you were back to your baseline within 60 minutes after that exercise session. That is a successful session. When do we need to adapt? We need to adapt if during the session, your symptoms increased by greater than 2 points. And remember, if they start to do that, you're going to pause. You're going to use palming or breath work to let those symptoms come back down, and you can try to resume. But if we go more than those 2 points for a second time, then that session is terminated at however length of time that was. So say you got 15 out of 20 minutes. That's okay. That means, and the other, when we need to adapt is that say you did stay within the 2 points of symptoms during the session, but you were not recovered within the 60 minutes after. So if either of those two things happen, then we are not progressing our exercise. So if either of those two things happen, then we're going to do one of two things. Number one, you can try at that same heart rate again and see if we can prolong the time. If we're still not having success with that, then we may actually want to decrease the intensity. Because we could keep working at this one intensity and keep meeting this ceiling of 15 minutes, or we can say, you know what, this isn't working. So we're going to decrease our heart rate by 5%, and we're going to go down to 55%, for example, and we're going to achieve success here. And then we can progress after. This is a typical 11-day acute concussion protocol that we use at my clinic. And again, it is based off of the study that came out of U of T. Also, termination if symptoms go greater than 8 out of 10. Sorry, I forgot that part. Okay. I hope, again, I just wanted this to be a very applicable, like I have an acute concussion. How do I start exercise? This is how you start exercise. This is so important. And I know those days that your symptoms feel like a 5 or a 6 out of 10, that this might be the last thing you want to do. You still have to do it. Okay. We know that obviously if we have a greater symptom burden, recovery typically takes longer. And if we have a greater symptom burden, this gets harder to do because you feel like garbage. But if your symptoms are below an 8 out of 10, then we need you to be doing some exercise. It truly is going to help facilitate a faster recovery for you. Do not blast through symptoms like we've talked about before. Really pay attention to that. Keep a log for this. It's very helpful to keep a log. You can also share that with your clinician as well. But this is a really key piece. And so if you're listening to this and you are a clinician and you are not guiding your clients in aerobic activity, please begin doing so. Or if you're someone who's listening to this and you've connected with a provider and you're going into week 2 and they haven't communicated with you about aerobic activity, use this as a resource, but then take it to them and have that discussion with them about, hey, can we get me started in this? Again, when we look at the evidence and we look at the research, introduction of that sub-threshold aerobic activity in those early days is one of the most positive tools we can have to help facilitate recovery. if you're listening to this and you are in a persistent stage of concussion, please, and you didn't exercise early, because I get this question all the time, please do not beat yourselves up. Please do not take yourself back into the what if spiral. Don't do that. It is never too late to begin to recover from concussion. It is never too late to begin to introduce aerobic activity, because what you're going to learn down the road when we do one on persistent concussion is we introduce it there too. But I hope that if you know someone who's had an acute concussion, if you've had an acute concussion, if you are a clinician who's working with acute concussion, that this gave you some insight into a very easily applicable protocol to begin to help support our clients in that acute concussion stage. Until next week, my friends, have an amazing day.